The colony nestled within the asteroid belt, a hidden speck in the vast expanse of the galaxy, was humanity's last stand. Captain Ilara Winters stood on the edge of the observation deck, staring out into the black void. The stars seemed distant, like pinpricks of light in an ocean of darkness. A dark thought gnawed at the back of her mind. How much longer could they last? The Uvarkians had swept through human colonies with brutal efficiency. Earth was gone, and so were most of the colonies that had once dotted human space. The survivors scattered, running for their lives, hoping to find refuge where no one would find them. The station, called Vanguard, had been their safe haven for months. It wasn't much, a repurposed mining station, rusted and barely functional, but it was all they had left. Captain Winters had once commanded a fleet, leading her crew with pride. But now, she commanded a few dozen refugees who were more survivors than soldiers. There was no grand strategy now, only the fight to stay alive. And as each day passed, it felt as though that fight was slipping further out of reach. She walked through the narrow corridors, where the walls groaned under the pressure of the asteroid's gravity. The engineers had done their best to keep the station running, but the energy levels were dwindling, and they had no way of knowing when the Uvarkian warships would finally track them down. The last communication from their scouts had come days ago. The Uvarkians are getting closer. Ilara's boots echoed as she approached the main briefing room. Inside, a map of the galaxy flickered on a makeshift projector, the projection unstable, yet still serviceable. Several survivors sat around the table, their eyes hollow, faces grim. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, engineers, scientists, doctors, all people who had once lived peaceful lives. Now, they were all that remained of humanity's last hope. Captain, one of them, a former naval strategist named Jonathan, said softly, breaking the silence, "We're running out of time. If the Uvarkians find us here," his voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. There would be no escape this time. The Uvarkians were relentless. Ilara clenched her fists. They had thought the war was over, she thought. That humanity would simply fade away into history, a forgotten relic of a time long gone. But that wouldn't be their legacy, not while she still breathed. "We're not finished," Ilara said, her voice steady, though her heart was heavy with doubt. "We'll fight. We'll find a way." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. She could see the skepticism in their eyes. These weren't soldiers. They were tired, broken people who had witnessed everything they loved destroyed. They had seen their families torn apart, their homes reduced to ash. But the fire in Ilara's chest still burned, and she wasn't ready to let it die just yet. "We may not have a fleet, but we have something they don't," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We have the will to survive. We've made it this far. We'll keep fighting, no matter what." She could feel their eyes on her, unsure but desperate for any shred of hope. Her words weren't a promise of victory. They couldn't be, but they were a promise of defiance. Humanity wouldn't go down without a fight. Outside, the stars flickered against the blackness of space, as cold and distant as the hope that now hung in the balance. But within the walls of Vanguard, something began to stir, something deep within the hearts of the survivors. Maybe they had lost everything, but they hadn't lost their will to fight. Not yet. And as long as they could still draw breath, they wouldn't give up. The days blended into one another at the Vanguard colony. The hum of machinery and the soft creak of the asteroid's shifting mass were the only sounds that marked the passing time. Each morning felt like a battle to keep the fear and despair at bay. For Ilara, the burden of leadership weighed heavy on her shoulders. With every conversation, every decision, she could sense the weariness in her people. They were tired, afraid, and losing hope. But as grim as things were, there was always a part of her that refused to accept their fate. She had led soldiers before, fought in space battles, and navigated the complexities of warfare. But this was different. They weren't an army anymore, just a handful of survivors. And yet, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there that could turn the tide. It was during one of the colony's regular supply runs, just another desperate attempt to scavenge anything that could help them, that Alara and her team made a discovery that would change everything. They ventured into an old sector of the asteroid belt that had once been home to a bustling mining colony. Now, it was little more than abandoned wreckage, forgotten by time and war. The air was thick with dust as they navigated through the eerie silence, their steps slow and cautious. Alara, along with Jonathan, the strategist, and several of the engineers, picked their way through the rusted remains of old mining equipment. They were searching for anything useful: food, parts, weapons, anything that could help their cause. It wasn't much, but they couldn't afford to be picky. Then they found it. Deep in the heart of the wreckage, half buried under layers of rusted metal and debris, was an old human warship, ancient and forgotten. The ship had been buried for decades, perhaps centuries. But what caught their attention wasn't its massive structure or the advanced technology that lay dormant within. It was what lay inside. Jonathan led them down into the ship's hold, where a strange metallic structure stood in the center of the room. It looked like a set of drums, large, ancient, and intricately designed. The surface of the drums was covered in dust, and their markings had faded with time. But there was something about them that made Alara's heart race. "This is impossible," Jonathan whispered, his eyes wide as he examined the drums. "These are war drums. They were used in Earth's military campaigns long before the Varkins came." Alara felt a surge of hope, almost like a flicker of light breaking through the dark clouds overhead. These drums, relics of an era long past, had been used by ancient human forces to rally troops for battle. The resonance they created wasn't just a sound. It was a call to arms, a rallying cry that stirred something deep within the hearts of those who heard it. She knew the stories of these drums from her training as a young officer, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. "Can they still work?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Jonathan frowned as he examined the intricate systems. "It's hard to say. They're old, but if we can power them up, they could transmit a signal across vast distances. It could be a beacon, a call to anyone still out there." Alara stared at the drums, a sense of urgency building in her chest. This was their chance. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol, a signal to the scattered survivors, to those who had lost hope. It was humanity's heartbeat, calling out across the void. She had to make a decision, and fast. "We have to activate them," she said firmly. "It's our only chance to unite the survivors and show the Yvarkians that we're still here. We won't be erased." Jonathan nodded, though his face was lined with uncertainty. "It'll be risky. If the Yvarkians detect the signal, they'll come for us. And we don't have the resources to fight them off." "We don't need to fight them off," Alara replied, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We just need to send the message." She turned to her team, her voice growing stronger. "Start working on getting them online. If there's even a chance this could help us, we have to take it. Humanity's not finished yet." As her team began the process of activating the war drums, Alara stood there for a moment, gazing out over the broken wreckage. She couldn't help but feel that something was stirring, something ancient and powerful. This was the beginning of something much bigger than just a fight for survival. It was a fight to reclaim what was theirs. And as the first hum of energy filled the air, Alara knew that humanity's future was about to change. The air in the command room was thick with tension as Alara watched the engineers work frantically to bring the ancient war drums to life. The hum of machinery echoed around them, a steady rhythm that mirrored her own quickening heartbeat. She stood over Jonathan, who was hunched over a console, his fingers dancing over keys as he worked to reroute the colony's remaining power to the drums. "We're almost there," Jonathan muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "If we can get this to work, it'll send a pulse across the galaxy. But there's no telling what kind of response we'll get." Ilara's eyes never left the display as she tried to calculate the risk. They had nothing to lose, really. They were already living on borrowed time, hiding in the shadows. But with these drums, they had a chance to ignite the spirit of rebellion in those who were still out there, hiding in the dark corners of space. "Do it," she said, her voice resolute. Jonathan nodded, and with a final tap of his fingers, the console hummed to life. The war drums, which had remained silent for centuries, began to stir. The ground beneath their feet vibrated as the massive drums started to resonate. A low, deep rumble filled the room, like the growl of an ancient beast waking from its slumber. For a moment, Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The sound was raw, primal, almost as if it had a life of its own. The war drums were more than just a relic. They were a symbol, a testament to humanity's resilience. It was a sound that had once rallied armies, driven them to victory. And now, it was awakening once more. As the beat grew louder, Ilara's mind raced. She could almost see the galaxies spread out before her, a sea of stars, each one holding the possibility of someone hearing the call. A message that humanity was still alive, still fighting, still unwilling to be erased. It was the defiance they had all been waiting for. "Signals transmitting," Jonathan said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "We're broadcasting across every frequency." Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the drums as the resonance deepened, now filling the entire station. It was as though the beat of the drums reverberated through the very fabric of space itself, sending a pulse that would travel farther than any human could imagine. She had no idea who would hear it, or if anyone still cared. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They were sending a message. Humanity was not dead. They were not a relic of the past. They were still here, and they were still capable of fighting back. But as the sound grew louder, something unexpected happened. The drums began to distort, their frequencies warping, sending out erratic pulses that surged through the ship's systems. The engineers scrambled to stabilize the signal, but Ilara's gut twisted with fear. Was it too much? Had they pushed the ancient technology beyond its limits? Before she could voice her concerns, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the room. Sparks flew from a console, and a series of alarms began to blare. Jonathan cursed under his breath, rushing to assess the damage. "What's happening?" Ilara demanded. "The power surge," Jonathan replied quickly. "The drums are drawing too much energy. We've got a system failure." Ilara's heart pounded as she looked at the team, their faces filled with panic. This was it. The Yvarkians could be monitoring the frequencies, and if they detected the disturbance, they would know exactly where to strike. The war drums, which had once been humanity's rallying cry, were now a beacon, one that could either inspire the last remnants of humanity or doom them to extinction. In that moment, Ilara knew they had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. They had sent the call. They had made their stand. Now, they would have to face whatever came next. The Yvarkians had always prided themselves on their dominance, confident in their superior technology and ruthless tactics. They had conquered planet after planet, effortlessly sweeping through humanity's defenses. The war seemed like a matter of course to them, an inevitable victory. But now, something had shifted. On the Yvarkian warship Eviscerator, Warlord Skor stood on the command deck, his sharp eyes fixed on the reports streaming in. He was an imposing figure, towering over his subordinates, his features cold and alien. He had led the invasion of Earth, watched as the human resistance crumbled beneath the might of his forces. Yet now, something unsettled him. The transmission had come out of nowhere, a strange, powerful pulse that disrupted their communication systems, causing them to lose contact with several outlying patrols. At first, Sucor thought it was just a fluke, a malfunction in their systems, but as more reports came in, his unease grew. Something was happening in human space, something they hadn't anticipated. "What is this?" Skor growled, slamming his fist against the command table. Explain it. Now. A lieutenant, visibly nervous, stepped forward. It's a signal, sir. A transmission. It seems to be coming from somewhere in the outer belt. It's human. Skor's mind raced. Humanity had been all but wiped out, with only scattered remnants hiding in the corners of space. They had no fleet, no resources to challenge the might of the Avarkians. The last time the Avarkians had seen any resistance was months ago, and since then, the galaxy had fallen into a tense but manageable peace. The humans, it seemed, had accepted their defeat. But this signal was different. It wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. The war drums, the lieutenant continued hesitantly. The frequencies, it's unlike anything we've encountered before. The sound is so deep, it's almost as if it's calling out to the stars. Skor narrowed his eyes. He had heard of these human war drums, ancient relics of a time long gone. Their existence was nothing more than myth, a story passed down by the few survivors who had escaped the Avarkian onslaught. To think that such an artifact still existed was both laughable and terrifying. But the fact that humanity had somehow revived them, it was enough to shake Skor's confidence. Send a fleet to investigate, Skor ordered. I want the source of that signal located and destroyed. Immediately. The lieutenant hesitated, eyes wide. Sir, if we send a fleet there, they might. I don't care about your concerns, Lieutenant, Skor interrupted. This is no mere fluke. This is a signal from the humans, one that could rally the rest of them. We need to stop it before they organize. Go now. The lieutenant nodded, his face pale. He quickly turned and barked orders to the bridge crew, preparing the fleet for an immediate assault. Skor's mind was already calculating their next move. This signal had sparked something deep within him, an unease he could not shake. The Avarkians had wiped out countless civilizations, but humanity had always been different. Their spirit, their refusal to accept defeat, was something Skor had underestimated. As the Avarkian fleet powered up and began its journey toward the source of the transmission, Skor stood in front of the viewport, staring out into the void of space. He knew the humans were cornered, isolated, desperate. But this was no longer just about survival. This was about their fight for dignity, for their place in the galaxy. Skor couldn't allow that to happen. The human signal was growing stronger with each passing moment, like the beating of a heart calling out into the stars. The Avarkians had believed they had broken humanity, but the drums were telling a different story. Across the galaxy, the war drum's deep, resonating pulse reverberated like the heartbeat of humanity itself. Ilara stood at the communication station, her fingers gripping the edge of the console as the vibrations from the drums hummed through the floor of the Vanguard station. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire universe had paused, caught in the ripple of that sound. A sound that carried the weight of a people long thought to be defeated, now rising from the ashes. The signal had only just begun to echo through the stars, but already Ilara could feel its power. It was more than just a warning. It was a call. It was a defiance, a declaration that humanity wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. In every corner of the galaxy, the survivors heard it, and they remembered. As the war drums continued to play, the message began to spread. Long-lost colonies and hidden outposts, many thought abandoned after the fall of Earth, began to stir. On forgotten ships drifting in the far reaches of space, on remote mining colonies far from the heart of human civilization, people looked up from their daily struggles and realized something had changed. There was hope. A captain in the Outer Rim, who had long since given up on any organized resistance, stood frozen in his cockpit as the pulse of the drums filtered through his comm systems. His old battered ship had been drifting alone for years, carrying the last remnants of his crew. He had convinced himself that Earth was lost, that the Avarkians' victory was final. Yet now, as the sound rang in his ears, he could feel something awaken inside him. A spark he thought had long been extinguished. What is that? He whispered to himself, his hands trembling as he began pulling up coordinates. Something told him this wasn't just a signal. This was the beginning of something much larger. Elsewhere, on a distant mining colony, workers, many of them descendants of the original colonists, paused in their work as the war drums pulsed through the station's speakers. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, their hearts heavy with the weight of years spent in hiding. But as the resonance filled the air, something stirred within them. They stood taller, their movements more certain, as though they had just remembered who they were. "We're not alone," one of the miners said, turning to the others. "The drums are calling. We need to answer." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out. Resistance cells that had been scattered and disorganized suddenly found themselves reinvigorated. A small fleet in the Arcturus system, which had been holed up in a barren moon, began to repair their ships. Former soldiers, once leaders of their respective units, picked up their old rifles, now ready to use them once again for a cause greater than themselves. The war drums had reminded them of their purpose. For the first time in months, hope began to pulse through humanity's veins. Back at Vanguard, Ilara stood in the command center, watching the reports come in. The colonies, the resistance, they were all reacting. Messages began flooding their communications as survivors from across the galaxy reached out, ready to rally under the banner of the war drums. It was only a matter of time before the Evarkians realized what was happening. "We can't waste any time," Ilara said, her voice firm as she turned to Jonathan. "The signal is out. Now we need to be ready. We've given them the rallying cry, but we have to make sure they know we won't back down. Not this time." Jonathan nodded. "We need to coordinate with the resistance fleets. If we can get a few more ships in position, we might be able to make a real stand." Ilara's eyes burned with determination as she looked out into the cold expanse of space. The drums had done their part, but now it was up to them. They had stirred something inside the scattered remnants of humanity, but the real battle was only beginning. As the signal continued to pulse, Ilara knew the Evarkians would come. They would try to snuff out the hope that was now spreading across the stars, but they underestimated humanity's will to survive. And this time, humanity wasn't hiding anymore. This time, they would fight. The days after the war drum's signal rippled through the galaxy were filled with uncertainty and anticipation. The survivors had heard the call, and they were responding. Yet, as the galaxy stirred with the possibility of rebellion, Ilara knew they were still a long way from victory. The Evarkians had not yet fully understood the scale of the uprising, but their response would be swift and brutal once they did. The last remnants of humanity could not afford to falter now. At Vanguard, Ilara paced in front of a newly established command table, watching as reports continued to flood in from various parts of the galaxy. Each message was a confirmation of what they had hoped for. The signal had worked. The resistance was growing. "We've got ships rallying in the Ord expanse," Jonathan reported, his eyes glued to the screen. "There's a small fleet forming in the Epsilon Eridani system, and we've just received word from the Marauders Guild. They're willing to send a fleet of their own, but they want us to hold up our end of the bargain. We'll have to send supplies to their strongholds in exchange for their help." Ilara nodded, though the weight of the situation hung heavy in her chest. There was strength in numbers, yes, but it wasn't enough. The Evarkians, with their advanced technology and massive war fleets, would not simply sit back and watch as humanity made its stand. They would come, and when they did, humanity would need every advantage they could get. "Send the message," she ordered, turning her gaze to the nearest officer. "We'll honor the deal with the Marauders Guild. The resistance needs all the firepower it can get. We'll make sure to stockpile weapons, food, anything we can spare, but we need to keep moving forward." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp tone of a new communication. The voice on the other end was clear, direct, but unmistakably urgent. "Captain Winters, we have a problem," the officer on the comms said. "A Evarkian fleet has just been spotted heading toward your position. They've locked onto your coordinates." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. They had known this was coming, but now it was real. The Yuvarkians were here. Their ships were closing in, and there was no escaping this confrontation. "Do we have a time frame?" Ilara asked, her voice even despite the rising panic in her chest. "Approximately 3 hours," the officer replied. "They're using their standard approach vector, but they're still too far out for us to engage. We don't have the firepower to challenge them yet." Ilara turned sharply toward Jonathan. "Can we get more ships here in time?" Jonathan's fingers flew over the console. "I've already sent out the alert to the nearby resistance fleets. They're on the move, but it'll take time to gather enough ships. We'll be able to mount a defense, but we need to buy that time." Ilara cut him off, her mind already racing. The Yuvarkians were relentless. This would be their chance to either wipe out the survivors completely or cripple humanity's last hope. "We'll hold the line," Ilara said, a cold determination in her voice. "Get our defenses up. Prepare for battle. We've got 3 hours to make sure we don't go down without taking a chunk of them with us." Her officers sprang into action, each moving with the urgency of those who knew what was at stake. She could hear the sharp clatter of boots as soldiers rushed to man stations, the hiss of doors opening and closing as the crew readied themselves. The pulse of the war drums still echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of why they had to fight. They had already sent the signal. Now it was time to back it up. As the Vanguard began its defensive preparations, Ilara stood at the observation deck, staring out at the empty void of space. She could already imagine the enemy fleet, silent, looming, ready to strike with overwhelming force. But she would not let fear take root. She would fight. The human spirit was not one to yield without a struggle. She had seen it in the eyes of every survivor she had met, heard it in their voices when they spoke of their lost homes and families. The Yuvarkians might have the power to destroy, but they could not break the will of humanity. Not yet. The quiet hum of the Vanguard's engines grew louder as Ilara watched from the command center. 3 hours. The countdown had begun. As the Yuvarkian fleet made its slow, deliberate approach, Ilara felt the weight of every moment pressing against her chest. The pressure of the upcoming battle was palpable, but beneath it all was something deeper, something that had been growing since the first pulse of the war drums had sounded. It was a quiet defiance, a stubborn belief that humanity was not done yet. "Captain Winters," Jonathan's voice broke through her thoughts, steady but filled with urgency. "The fleet from Epsilon Eridani just made it into range. They've got a handful of battle cruisers and a lot of firepower, but we're still outgunned. We need to make sure we position them right before the Yuvarkians arrive." Ilara nodded, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the command table. The decision was clear. She had no illusions about their chances in a direct confrontation, but they couldn't let the Yuvarkians think they could just wipe them out with ease. The survivors would make their stand here, in this broken corner of space. "Divert all power to shields," Ilara ordered, her voice commanding. "We need to hold them off long enough for reinforcements to reach us, and position our fighters to intercept the Yuvarkian ships before they can get close." The officers around her moved quickly, their faces set with determination. Ilara felt a momentary surge of pride. This crew, these people, had been through so much already. And now, with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance, they were ready to do what had to be done. As the Yuvarkian fleet loomed closer, the first signs of movement appeared on the scanners. Several large warships, bristling with weapons, flanked by smaller destroyers and support craft. Their dark hulls loomed like shadows against the backdrop of stars. The Yuvarkians were here, and they were ready to finish what they had started. Ilara's mind sharpened as she focused on the battle ahead. She knew they were outgunned, outmatched in almost every way. But they had one thing the Yuvarkians didn't: the spirit of survival. Humanity had always been adaptable, capable of finding ways to win against overwhelming odds. "Launch fighters," she commanded. "We're buying as much time as we can." The hangar doors opened with a low rumble as their squadron of sleek, makeshift fighters shot out into space. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the small ships form up in a defensive perimeter around the Vanguard. The Evarkians had their own fighter wings, but these pilots had nothing to lose. Every one of them had fought to survive, to keep going in a galaxy that had long since forgotten them. Now they would fight for their future. The first wave of Evarkian ships entered the combat zone, and within moments, the sky around them erupted into chaos. Lasers streaked across the void, lighting up the cold expanse of space like fireworks in the darkness. The fighters engaged the Evarkian interceptors with speed and precision, weaving through fire and returning fire with everything they had. It wasn't a fair fight. The odds were still stacked against them, but the humans fought with a fury that caught the Evarkians off guard. "Ilara," Jonathan's voice cut through the comms again. "They're breaking through the perimeter. The enemy ships are closer than we thought. They'll reach us in minutes." Ilara's jaw clenched as she watched the battle unfold. She could already see the first of the Evarkian destroyers moving into firing range, their weapons charging with deadly intent. She couldn't afford to lose any more time. The next move had to be decisive. "Activate the main cannons," she ordered. "We're taking the fight to them." The crew sprang into action, and the Vanguard's massive energy cannons hummed to life. The sheer power of the weapons was enough to shake the entire ship, but Ilara stood firm, knowing this was the only chance they had to slow the Evarkians down. As the first blast from the Vanguard tore through the void, striking one of the Evarkian destroyers with a direct hit, Ilara felt a rush of hope. They weren't just going to roll over and die. Not today. Not while humanity still had the strength to fight back. But the battle was far from won. The Evarkian forces were relentless, and this would be just the beginning. Ilara knew that, but as she watched the explosions light up the blackness of space, she also knew this. Humanity's heart had not been extinguished. Not yet. The battle raged on, chaos unfolding all around Ilara. The Vanguard shuddered with each impact, yet it held its ground. In the vast emptiness of space, the clash of weapons created a deadly symphony. Laser fire, energy pulses, and the deafening hum of engines straining against the forces of war. The Evarkian fleet was formidable, but the humans aboard the Vanguard fought with everything they had, every scrap of their willpower focused on survival. "Shield strength at 40%, Captain." Jonathan's voice echoed in Ilara's earpiece, urgent and tinged with fear. "We can't take much more of this." Ilara's jaw clenched as she gripped the command table, her eyes fixed on the battlefield. The Evarkians had pushed them back, their warships closing in, but they weren't finished yet, not while she had breath in her lungs. "Activate the secondary shield array," Ilara ordered, her voice calm but filled with the weight of authority. "And get those fighters back in position. We're not done yet." "Roger that," Jonathan replied. The crew moved quickly, scrambling to reinforce the ship's defense systems. The secondary shields hummed to life, spreading a faint shimmer of energy across the ship's hull, adding a layer of protection that bought them precious moments. But those moments were ticking away. Ilara's mind raced, calculating their options. They were losing ground. The Evarkian fleet, though battered, was far from defeated. And the reinforcements they had called for, those ships from the outer colonies, were still hours away. The reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. They were on the edge of being overwhelmed. And yet, there was something about the way the fighters maneuvered, the way the crew rallied around each command, that sparked something inside her. Humanity had been underestimated for so long. The Evarkians thought they had broken them, erased their will to fight. But the war drums were still echoing through the stars, and that pulse was more than just a sound. It was a promise. "We won't stop," Ilara muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. Not today. As the Evarkian forces closed in, their massive destroyers unleashing devastating barrages, Ilara made her decision. "Prepare to engage the hyperdrive," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "We're going to hit them with everything we've got. And then we're jumping straight into the heart of their fleet." "Captain, are you sure?" Jonathan asked, hesitation in his voice. "We're still not fully charged. The jump might be unstable. We don't have a choice, Ilara replied, her eyes scanning the redouts. We're not just going to fight for survival. We're going to make them regret underestimating humanity. We're taking the fight to their doorstep. The crew, sensing the resolve in Ilara's voice, moved with renewed urgency. They knew what was at stake now. It wasn't just about holding the line. It was about sending a message to the Avarkians that humanity would not bend, not break, not disappear into the darkness of space. With a deep rumble, the Vanguard's engines roared to life. The hyperdrive systems hummed, charging with a power that sent tremors through the ship. The Avarkian fleet was almost upon them, but Ilara trusted in the crew's preparations. She had a plan, one last desperate gamble to turn the tide. "Captain, we're ready," Jonathan said, his voice taut with anticipation. "Now," Ilara commanded. In that instant, the Vanguard surged forward, its weapons lighting up as the energy cannons unleashed their full fury at the Avarkian destroyers. The sheer force of the barrage forced the enemy ships to falter, their shields flickering under the intensity of the attack. And then, with a deafening roar, the Vanguard activated its hyperdrive, tearing a rift through space itself. The ship hurtled forward, launching itself into the heart of the Avarkian fleet, scattering enemy ships like leaves caught in a storm. The Vanguard's sudden movement threw the Avarkians off balance, forcing them to scramble to react. For a brief moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. And then, in that moment of chaos, humanity's fight was far from over. It had just begun.